Today's episode of the Top 11 podcast is sponsored by the San Francisco Giants 11 Greatest Games of the Decade. This is round 3. So for all of those who've been keeping up, the first round was the 49ers, top 11 games of the decade. Last round, which we did earlier this week, was the Golden State Warriors, top 11 games of the decade. And now we go over to the other dynasty that took place this decade in San Francisco. Yes, for those of you who are only 49ers fans, we actually won this many games. I'm a little disappointed that you missed out, but I'm glad you're here now. That's all that counts. The San Francisco Giants dynasty run, which took place from 2010 to 2014. If you heard one of our earlier episodes, Candlestick Will broke down that this is only the 5th time in MLB history that a team has been able to win 3 World Series in a 5-year span. Only the 5th time in over 100 years of World Series that this has happened. And this run took place from 2010 to 2014. But obviously we're here to discuss what the greatest games of the decade are. So perhaps there are other games. We're going to find out. Before we get started, though, Raymond, why don't you let them know where can they find us?
You can like us on Facebook.com/TheGoldCast, and you can follow us on Twitter at @the_GoldCast, and be sure to subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Stitcher, all under the same moniker of The GoldCast. Like, subscribe, and comment because we certainly want to get your take on this juicy episode.
Oh, yeah. And then Candlestick Will, where can they find us to give their top 11 lists for the 49ers, the Warriors, and the Giants? Where do they find us for that?
Easiest way is to go to Top 11 Podcast on Twitter, and it's at Top 11 Podcast. So Top 11 Podcast.
Awesome. And Candlestick Will, if they want to talk to you directly, where can they find you?
Easiest way is also Twitter at Candlestick Will.
And Raymond, if they want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
You can always find me on Twitter at Ray Solis and Instagram at Ray Solis1.
Awesome. And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at my new handle, I am Rudy 3rd. I am Rudy 3RD. All right, guys, let's get into it. We have a lot to unpack. This is the final opening round of our top 11 tournament. As we mentioned before to all the GoldCast Nation, there is no March Madness this year, but there is a top 11 tournament. And so this is our March Madness, determining what the greatest games of the last 10 years have been for our favorite teams, the Niners, the Warriors, and now the Giants. But first, as always, the greatest intro in the podcast game. The top 11 crew is here. Class is in session. Let's go.
San Francisco, are you ready?
This is the GoldCast.
Boom! Welcome to another edition of the Top 11 Podcast. We are the voice of the Bay. I'm your host, Rudy Solis III, and with me is my brother, my co-host,
Raymond Solis first, baby.
And our esteemed co-host,
Candlestick Will.
Boom! Yes. All right, gentlemen, we are here. This is the end of the opening round. SF Giants, the second dynasty, the first dynasty that we experienced, but the second on our top 11 tournament. And I want to start, before we even begin with delivering our lists, I just want to talk about, I have a couple questions for you guys. Like, how do you feel now that it's done, even though we haven't revealed our lists yet? Now that you've done all lists for the Warriors, the Niners, and the Giants, how does it feel? Which was the hardest? Which was the easiest? And what do you think going into our final round, our top 11 tournament, to determine what are the 11 greatest Bay Area games of all time? So, Candlestick Will, this is your brainchild. This is your baby. So I'm going to start with you. Where are you at now that you've done all 3 lists? Where are you, like, which was the hardest? And what do you feel about the totality of your 33 games?
Well, so the Niners one was probably the hardest for me just because I don't have the same history that you two do on the most recent decade of the Niners. So I had to do a lot more research to really kind of break down my list, get some feedback from people that knew more than I did. With the Giants and Warriors, it was kind of like, ranking your kids. It was a little bit more difficult because there's so many games that just meant so much to me as a fan. So it was a good problem to have, honestly, because, it's like at the end of the day, you're ranking World Series appearances and you're ranking NBA Finals appearances. So it was pretty amazing in that regard, especially considering some of the futility in previous decades. So ultimately, I think it was just entertaining ultimately for me, for the Warriors and Giants. And then just it was nice to kind of rehash some of the best Niner games. And I have so many friends and family that are diehard Niner fans, so it's always good to be able to share the best moments of a team with people that care about it.
That's awesome. Now, Raymond, what about you? Not looking back on the 33 games you have now put together, how do you feel overall? And then what was the easiest list? What was the hardest list?
This was the hardest list by far, just because there's 42 games between National League Championship and World Series alone, not even counting NLDS. So to just pick 11 out of 60, 70 games is a tall task. To say no to majority of the games, and just, some stood out more than others. For example, the top 3 were the easiest for me to figure out, but it was all the games leading up to that in my list that I was kind of challenged by, just because there's so many moments throughout these 3 years. Especially, these are 3 championship years, similar to the NBA, but in baseball, every play is much more significant, because baseball, like football, is a game of inches, and 1 inch in the wrong direction can cost you a game, unlike the NBA. So it was a lot more difficult cutting games out of this list than the previous 2.
So let me ask you this. Let me do a follow-up question now. But having said that, the NLDS is a best of 5, and then the NLCS is a best of 7. But NBA, it's 7 games all the way across. So it technically aren't there more games in the NBA than there are in the MLB? What was it about this that made, even though there's more games in the NBA than there are in the MLB, why? I know that you said it's a game of inches, but what is it? Is it just like that there's so many close calls with the Giants that made it tougher versus picking for the Warriors?
Yeah, it's not like there was a bunch of 1 point difference games in basketball. The Warriors, being a dominant team, exemplifying a new era and style of basketball that no one had ever seen before, and it really taken the association by surprise to a very, to a dominant extent. It's not like the Giants created a new form of baseball philosophy that took the major league by storm. They really didn't. It was, same old small ball baseball type of game where 1 run wins the game, or it's 1-0 or 2-1 over a span of 10 or 18 innings. It's just a different breed of sport in comparison to NBA. And even though the NBA postseason is longer than Major League is still a game of inches, whereas basketball is not a game of inches at all. A lot of times the games are decided, what the outcome's going to be midway through the fourth quarter, or even by the fourth quarter sometimes if the game is that convincing, especially with the Warriors. The Warriors didn't really give up a lot of leads in the past 5 years, except for, one particular season. But outside of that, the Warriors had pretty decisive wins. There wasn't like nail-biting games outside of when their backs were against the rope.
Those Klay Thompson Game 6 games.
A lot of the Klay Thompson games when they were down 0-2 against Cleveland in the first championship. But again, that's kind of a broader spectrum of perspective versus the baseball, which again comes down to 1 inning or 1 pitch or 1 swing.
Yeah, there are playoff games that are on my list where the Giants won 1-0.
Yeah,
literally 1-0,
yep,
1 run.
I got one of those.
I like that. For me, the order goes like this: the Warriors was the hardest, the 49ers probably the easiest, and the Giants was in the middle. I thought the Giants was pretty easy overall. I thought it was about as easy as the Niners. I just had a really clear picture of, And I think maybe this is what made it hard for you is what made it easier for me. It was like I had a clear picture of very specific games, because in basketball and baseball, it's like one or two things happens and that's what determines the game. So I was like, well, here's 1 through 3 easy for me. I think 1 through 3 has been easy for all of us on all these lists overall. It's just where they end up is a little different, but it's pretty much the same 1 through 3 almost across the board. With the exception of the Warriors one with Candlestick Will and his games. But in general, for me, that was about the Giants. It was like, I just know what are my favorite games from their entire postseason run. I know I had a pretty clear-cut vision of like the 5 or 6 big major games. And I'm like, because it really came down to one moment. And so for me, really what the challenge was figuring out which moment was more important to me. Which game did I rank ahead of the others? And which of those great moments did I think deserve to be where on the list? But I think that's what made it easier for me. Whereas the NBA, the Warriors ones, there's so much happening all the time. I'm like, well, what are the significant moments that really define this game versus another? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the challenge for me. Going back to you, Candlestick Will, looking forward to the top 11 tournament, and we kind of said this offline already, this is going to be a bloodbath. But we've got these 3 very successful teams, but we have one team, unfortunately, that has not captured any championships and 2 dynasties. I mean, let's just be honest here. But the Niners 100% are the most important team to San Francisco. The Golden State Warriors are the most important team to the Bay, and the Giants are kind of somewhere in the middle. What do you anticipate going into the final round of our top 11 tournament?
I think it's going to impact, how we rank them, because I don't think we're going to be able to just take our 11 lists and then just put in like the top 4 or 5 from each one and then reorganize it. I think sometimes games that maybe we put lower, like maybe 7 or 8 on one list, might be a lot higher when you look at it across the Bay, because just like you mentioned, championships are going to matter more. So, if we had some regular season game really high for the Niners or the Giants or the Warriors, that regular season game might not have the same impact on a list that's looking across sports and across the Bay. That it might come down to just which championships matter the most and which moments matter the most. And also, when we had moments like a big game for Steph Curry that kind of announced his legend status in the league, maybe a game like that would still resonate on a top 11 list across all 3 sports, because of the way that Steph Curry's kind of taken over the Bay in a way, and become the top player in all of the Bay Area across the sports. So, it'll be interesting to see how we end up maybe reevaluating games that we had at certain places on our list for this one.
Absolutely. Raymond, throwing that same question to you, looking forward towards the tournament, the final tournament, how do you see that playing out? Well, obviously, the Niners' importance to San Francisco versus the Warriors to the Bay and the Giants in the middle. How do you see that playing out for your list as you determine what the final top 11 games are going to be?
Knowing what my criteria has how it's shaped up between each list, I think that is going to be easier than this Giants list.
Are you going to let me ask you this. Are you basically going to be pitting like everybody's top 3 against each other and then deciding what like the final 2 games are? Is it going to be like that? Is it? I mean, I don't want you to give us too much of a spoiler, but I'm saying, is it going to be something like that? You're like, okay, well, here's the most important games, because I'm going to say this, and we talked about this offline before we started recording. The Navarro Bowman final Candlestick game, that to me is really big and like really important, and maybe might rank at a different place on this list than it did on the Niners list, but but I might put it ahead of certain things. I might put it behind certain things. So, I mean, when you say it's easier, what does that mean for you?
Because it comes down to criteria. For me, my criteria is very specific. The wins matter the most. So it's just a matter of figuring out which wins are more significant than another? Which one was more impactful? Which one was more thrilling? Which victory had, more significance to their team, or what got it started? For the Giants and the Warriors, I think is going to be much tougher than the Niners, because you have two dynasties versus one trying to start one. Two teams that are dynasties versus one team that's still trying to become a dynasty. And so, I think just with that alone, to me, it's just a matter of like, all right, which championship win, is better than the other, and how do I rank it? That's really kind of where I'm at. Whereas this Giants list, to me, this was a tough list to come up with. And I didn't even, in the interest of time, my honorable mentions list is short and sweet, but the honorable mentions list could easily have had, 10 or 12 games.
I love that. I can't wait to hear your list just because you wrestled with it so much. Looking forward, it is going to be tough, and I'll tell you why. And, as Candlestick Will loves to promote on this podcast, he promotes bias. As a San Francisco diehard native, I always can't help but look at everything from San Francisco looking out towards the Bay. and so for me, what happens in San Francisco for me always tends to carry the most weight, as it is the San Francisco Bay Area and the premier city in the Bay and my hometown. So it is it's going to be tricky, because I'm going to try to play fair to the Bay, but at the same time my bias for San Francisco always plays a role, and I never hide my bias. Like there are many famous sports analysts and journalists and talking heads and podcasters that have no problem admitting their bias. I am diehard San Francisco to the very end. I feel this way the way other guys feel about New York and Boston, and especially with all the success. But I also have to be kind of realistic into saying, well, I can't throw just this one random game for the Niners ahead of literally a championship. So it's going to be tricky for me. I think that list is going to be kind of tough for me as I kind of navigate my own bias and at the same time try to be fair to the whole Bay. So we'll see. All right, gentlemen, let's get into this round, the third and final round before we enter our top 11 tournament finals to determine what the 11 best games of the decade are. And as always, we start with Ray. So Raymond, a lot of hype for this list, this tough list. Give us your opening list.
All right, number 11, I've got the 2010 October 7th Atlanta versus San Francisco NLDS Game 1. Number 10, I've got 2012 October 9th San Francisco versus Cincinnati NLDS Game 3. And number 9, I have 2014 October 4th San Francisco versus Washington Nationals, the NLDS Game 2. And for number 8, I've got 2014 again, October 1st, San Francisco versus the Nationals again. Sorry, I have an error here. Oh, the wild card game.
The wild card game is number 8. Which one, from 2014?
Against the Pirates, yeah.
Rudy, what about you?
All right. For number 11, it is a regular season game, October 3rd, 2010, game 162. At number 10, another regular season game, June 13th, 2012, game 63. At number 9, October 7th, 2010, NLDS game 1, Raymond's game 11. And then number 8, October 4th, 2014, NLDS Game 2. Candlestick Will, what about you?
So for number 11, I have Game 162 from 2010. For number 10, I've got a three-way tie for the 2012 NLCS Games 5, 6, and 7. For number 9, I've got the 2012 World Series Game 4. And for number 8, I've got the 2010 NLDS Game 1.
Ooh, so hold on. We have a tie. You and I both have game 162 at number 11. I love it.
And we both have the NLDS Game 1 in our first group.
In fact, all of us do, because Raymond has the NLDS Game 1 at his number 11. Everybody has the NLDS Game 1 in their opening round 11 through 8. That's dope.
And even after we've just said that, I think we can all probably agree that we've probably underrated that game, as we'll talk about. But I think that game is actually way underrated, and we probably should all have it higher. But it's okay.
You're probably right. You're literally probably right, especially if you think about just the totality. We'll talk about it in a second.
But Ray, break down your list.
So 2010 I picked because it's the game that really got this whole thing started, and Tim Lincecum blanks the Atlanta Braves in Game 1, and just a 2-hit shutout game. Just a magnificent performance on a pitcher, who had a brilliant, who had been dominant in his first 2 seasons coming into the league with back-to-back Cy Youngs, and then kind of had a little bit of up and downs after that, but was able to really kind of come back into his usual self in this pitching performance. And that's really what stood out to me the most in this game. That in addition to Cody Ross getting the lone RBI, which would seal the win. And that would be the beginning of Cody Ross's run as well. And so that, to me, was the reason why I chose that game. The next game, the 2010 NLDS Game 3 against the Reds, that was another one that one stood out to me for, just again, it was another brilliant performance. This was... The Sergio Romo got the win at the end of this one. This was another tight game, as there is a lot of tight games throughout the history of this postseason run by the Giants. But this was another one-run game here that was just, again, just another terrific performance, pitching performance, and, getting the closeout at the end. It was really, really tight. It went through 10 innings. It took 10 innings to get this one done. And when it did get done, it was Angel Pagan that got the run off, I believe, a sac fly. And then the next game, number 9, was 2014 NLDS Game 2 against the Nationals. Again, we have another 2-1 victory. This was the Yasumero Petit game. That's the pitcher I referenced in this one. Although Tim Hudson had a great performance. He gave 7 strong innings, only giving up 1 run, and struck out 8. And I love me some Tim Hudson, especially from his days with the Oakland Athletics. But Petit came in really late in this game too, and gave a really strong inning. What is he? He pitched 6 innings. That's right. He pitched 6 innings and struck out 7. He was brilliant in his performance, and everyone that came in really, between Javier Lopez, Romo, Jeremy Apfel, Santiago Casilla, who drove me crazy. I couldn't stand that pitcher. I thought he was a good setup man, just not a good closer.
I remember that.
He loved to close for because he was just that. He just had that attitude. He loved it, even though he wasn't very good at it.
He did,
and at least by my opinion. And again, this was a game that was won in the 18th inning. This was great, and this was Brandon Belt that won this one with a bomb there. And that was just an amazing game. I watched all of it. It was painstaking. Again, torture, Giants torture. And then the wild card game in 2014, just because it was a one game do or die. 2014, we weren't as dominant as we were in the previous 2 seasons. Well, 2014 was, I think, we were the most confident and dominant. 2012, we also won over 90 games, but this was 2014. We won 88 games and barely made it into the postseason. And once we did, though, then I think the rest of the league really got concerned, and Madison Bumgarner led things off with an 8-run shutout, offensive juggernaut. Pittsburgh just never had an answer. Madison Bumgarner went 9 innings, struck out 10. Only gave up 4 hits and 1 walk. It was just boom. It was a statement like, hey, we're in the playoffs and don't forget about us.
All right. What about you, Rudy?
All right, so we begin first with my only 2 regular season games that ended up on the list. October 3rd, 2010, game 162, tied with Candlestick Will. Giants clinch the NL West for the first time in 7 seasons. All they had to do, and Raymond, you already said the buzzword, and I'm going to say it right after this. All they had to do was win 1 game in their final 3 against the Padres. But, of course, they lose the first 2 games and have to win the final game of the season. It is pure torture. And that became the motto for all of the 2010 season, all the 2012 season, torture. That the Giants, the thing about this crew in the very first year, the 2010, the Misfits crew, very famously known as the Misfits crew for our 49ers Goldcasters. These guys were the Misfits, right? They were good, but not great. Kind of really their whole season kind of was on the backs of Tim Lincecum and Matt Cain. Bumgarner, this was the season where Bumgarner was good and had a lot of potential, but was far from the Bumgarner of 2014 where he is the pitching postseason god. He's not there yet. He still is. I remember when Bumgarner would come on the mound, I would get nervous. I would still be like, well, I don't know if this Bumgarner kid's going to be able to pull it off. But this really was the Freak's best year, Tim Lincecum, and it literally came down to the final game of the season for the Giants. And of course, it is the shortest stint in MLB history at being number 1. They win their final game and immediately have to go into the playoffs. It was pure torture. And in typical Giants fashion, as already mentioned, they had their final series with the Padres. If they win 1 game against the Padres are out and the Giants are going. But of course, they lose the first 2 and they have to win the final game on the final day of their season just to get into the post. Final score 3-0. Sanchez with the win. Brian Wilson with the save. Brian Wilson famously beginning the fear the beard chant that ended up James Harden adopted, and there's some guy from hockey that adopted. But if you grew a big giant beard in the last 10 years, whether you realize it or not, it's because of Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson literally started the Fear the Beard movement. The first beard that we were rooting for in sports was Brian Wilson. And if you're wearing a beard, it's because of him. That whole trend that ended up capturing the entire 2010s started with Brian Wilson. And Brian Wilson with the save, October. That game, super huge game, a lot of significance. I was at my number 11. Number 10, I put June 13, 2012, game 63, Matt Cain's perfect game. The final score is 10-0. Cain with the win. 22nd perfect game in MLB history. First by the Giants. Cain retired 27 batters and tallied 14 strikeouts, beating his previous record of 12 strikeouts. The perfect game was also saved by Melky Cabrera, the infamous Milkman, in the 6th, and then Gregor Blanco in the top of the 7th. But for me, even though the October 3rd, 2010 game obviously has so much postseason significance, is literally the game that gets us in and begins the dynasty. This game to me is the most memorable regular season game of that entire run. When I sat down, there was one game that I remembered even more than October 3rd, 2010. And that was Matt Cain's perfect game. And it had to make the list. I don't rank it higher than the postseason games because there are so many crazy, insane, brutal games that come beyond this. Very, like as we said, very Klay Thompson game 6-ish games for the Giants. Many versions of that. But this game is the most memorable game, and that's why I put it at number 10. At number 9, October 7, 2010, the NLDS Game 1. Giants top the Braves. Similar to you, Raymond, this is Tim Lincecum's coming out party. This is it. The legend of the Freak is beginning. Now we finally get to see what this kid do in the post. We've had 2 years of dominance, back-to-back Cy Youngs, and now we see what he does. And Cody Ross with the 1 run, but Tim Lincecum blanks, and boom, we have our first win in the post against the Braves. Blanks them, and we move on to Game 2. Number 8, October 4th, 2014, NLDS Game 2, This also ended up on your list. This also ended up on your guys' list. Giants defeat the Nats in 18 innings to take the lead. I saw this entire game. I believe this was the longest game in postseason history when it first went down. His final score was only 2-1. It was like over 3 hours. It was brutal. But if you were a Giants or Nats fan, you were on the edge of your seat. And the reason this game is so important, and the reason I put it at my number 8, is because everybody thought that this was the Nats' year. The Nationals were going to do it. They were finally going to cement their place and win their World Series. And even though this was a big series, I saw a lot of people going with Bryce Harper and the Nats. Bryce Harper and the Nats are going with Bryce Harper and the Nats and saying, "Hey, this is their series to lose. The Nats got this. They're going all the way." And no one really believed that we had what it took. And then when we won this game, when we beat them in this game, this was the game that broke their back. This was the game, and you saw it and you felt it. And I got to give props to Bryce Harper, who I'm not always the biggest fan of. But Bryce Harper was the only player that I saw during that entire game that wanted to win. Everyone else gave up. I felt like they gave up once we went to extra innings. Harper wanted to have this game, and I give props to him. He's the one guy I give props to. But this was the game that broke their back, and this was, to me, was one of the big turning points in that postseason run where it was like, all right, we're going to do this. And I really feel like that 2014 run kind of reminds me of the Warriors' final run for the NBA Finals, where we were just really – we weren't the most talented team. We weren't the best team. I mean, our lead pitching was kind of suspect, and that becomes really obvious when we enter the final series of the World Series of 2014. But really what got us there was the experience, that we just knew how to close out the big games. We knew what it took to win in the clutch moments, what this took to make this run. This is almost the exact same team from 2012, and we were really winning mostly more based on experience and not necessarily talent, and this game really proved that. All right, Candlestick Will, give us defend your first 4.
So for 11, I had the same as you, the game 162. One of the themes, I think, for my list and kind of where I rank things was that, there were some games where if they don't win this game, then there are no other games, and the 2010 season was one where there was no guarantee of the playoffs. They were chasing the Padres, all the way up until the final game of the year. Had to win the last game to make the playoffs. And so for the fact that they didn't make the playoffs between 2004 and 2009, they had the crushing loss in 2003 to the Marlins, and then obviously the heartbreak of 2002, that, this was a long time coming to just make the playoffs again. And the fact that they were able to beat the Padres that day, and the way that the team pitched that day, the entire bullpen was just lights out, from everyone from Ramon Ramirez to Santiago Garcia to Sergio Romo. I mean, it was one of the most impressive games all across the board. Buster Posey's home run was just huge and just signified what an impact player he was about to become for the next half decade. And ultimately, it was what started this whole run. And so that's where my list starts as well. Like I said, I had a 3-way tie for number 10, really because the entire 2012 postseason was a pretty crazy one. And the 3 NLCS games against St. Louis were certainly right up there with as far as the same intensity that you guys have been talking about with some of the other games, and it was crazy. I mean, they had to win three games in a row. They had done it before with the Reds in the previous round, and then here comes the Cardinals, and they're down 3-1, and they have to win 3 straight again. So it was an incredible postseason in those first 2 rounds, and everyone remembers the game 5 as the Rally Zito game, where Barry Zito, who wasn't even on the 2010 playoff roster, had suddenly become a big part of the the Giants rotation, and he went out there and he blanked them and had an incredible game. The Giants win 5-0 and just dominated the Cardinals in a must-win. They come back the very next night, or not the very next night, but 2 nights later, and Ryan Vogelsong completely shuts down the Cardinals as well. And we go from Rally Zito to Rally Enchiladas. And Ryan Vogelsong was, always lights out in the playoffs, which was his calling card, was his perfect record in the playoffs. And then Matt Cain, like he did that entire season, he was there for the clincher, and the Giants just completely destroyed the Cardinals 9-0. And the main guy that people remember from that series is Marco Scutaro. Matt Holliday was the villain of the story, sliding right into Scutaro and trying to hurt him. And Scutaro comes right back, laces a double right at Holliday's face that he ends up playing wrong and ends up clearing the bases.
That was badass. That was so badass.
And he hit like 500 in the series. So I had originally just put Game 7 for just how perfect that game was. The rain coming down on Scutaro and him looking up at the heavens, and just the narrative of that game was just perfect. Him catching the last out. But it's impossible to have a top 11 list, in my opinion, without at least giving a shout out or including the Rally Zito game and the Ryan Vogelsong Game 6. So to me, the best way to honor those 2 games before Game 7 is just to have them all be a 3-way tie. For number 9, I had the 2012 World Series Game 4. The World Series ended up being somewhat anticlimactic because they were able to sweep the best team in baseball in the Detroit Tigers, and our pitching was just incredible throughout. But Game 4 was a nail biter, and Romo being able to get the Triple Crown winner Miguel Cabrera looking was just one of the most incredible endings to a game in Giants history. Buster Posey's home run in that game was also huge, and it's just it reminds you of just how improbable and how incredible these playoff runs were, because that kind of a script would have been thrown out. That they would have just dominated the way they did in the World Series after the way that they had to play the first 2 rounds. And what Romo was able to do in that game, and what people also forget in that game is Jeremy Affeldt going 3 up, 3 down against the heart of the order, with including Miguel Cabrera and Prince Fielder,
our best reliever.
Our best reliever.
Yeah.
He was so lights out, and even he was so at the end of those ropes those last 2 years, those last 2 playoff runs, but he just kept chugging away. And again, we talked about, it was all experience. It wasn't even talent at that point, because his talent, the strength of his youth was clearly gone.
Well, he was the best. He's the best relief pitcher statistically outside of Mariano Rivera in the history of the playoffs. So as far as relievers go, so however you want to describe it, he was perfect when it mattered.
Yep.
Because he didn't give up a single run as a Giants reliever, and did it in over 23 innings. So. There were some key moments in his career in each of those championship runs, but being able to get Cabrera, Young, and Fielder and get that heart of the order in that Game 4 was as big a part of that game as anything. So,
yep.
So that's why I have that at number 9, and then number 8, the game that we all have in this first group, the 2010 NLDS Game 1 from Lincecum, with 14 strikeouts. I think the biggest reason why I kind of alluded to the idea that this was probably underrated by all of us is that, the one thing the Giants didn't have was experience in 2010. People were looking at the Giants and just assuming they wouldn't do well in the playoffs because they didn't have playoff experience. And Tim Lincecum couldn't give less of a shit of that narrative. And he just went out and just destroyed the Braves. They had no idea what was coming. Even when they did know what was coming, it didn't matter. Lincecum completely shut him down. The fact that he went a complete game and went 14 strikeouts, it was the Giants' way of saying, yeah, it doesn't really matter what experience we have because you're not going to get a hit. You're not going to get a run, and this pitching staff is going to dominate you. And you're not going to beat Lincecum this year, so you better find a way to beat somebody else because there's no way you're beating Lincecum. And that scared the hell out of everybody. And it put pressure on every other team in 2010 that you better figure it out because you're not going to beat Lincecum no matter who you have. And to me, that's the legacy of Game 1. And when you really think about it, it's like that game sent the same kind of a message that we were talking about last week with Steph Curry, that some of the performances he had, it was like, oh shit, I guess Steph Curry is going to be a problem. Well, in 2010, at least in that season, it was like, oh shit, Tim Lincecum is going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. All right, so Ray, what do you got for 4 through 7?
So, or you mean? Oh, sorry, yes. Okay, so you read it in the reverse order, so I'm like, what? I'm like, we're already on 4?
What do you have 7 through 4?
Yeah. So number 7, I've got 2010 again, topping this group, October 16th, San Francisco Giants against the Philadelphia Phillies, NLCS Game 1. Number 6, I've got 2012, October 11th, San Francisco versus the Reds, NLDS Game 5. And number 5, I've got 2012, again, October 19th, San Francisco versus the St. Louis. That's NLCS Game 5, a game you've already referenced. And then number 4, I've got 2014, October 26th, Kansas City Royals versus the Giants World Series Game 5.
Oh.
All right, Rudy, what about you?
All right. At number 7, October 9th, 2012, NLDS Game 3. At number 6, October 22nd, 2012, NLCS Game 7. At number 5, October 16th, 2014, NLCS Game 5. And then at number 4, October 21st, 2012, NLCS Game 5. Raymond, almost a tie between you and me. Very close on that one. Candlestick Will, what about you?
So at number 7, I have the 2012 World Series Game 1. For number 6, I have the 2014 World Series Game 7. For number 5, I have June 13th, 2012, the perfect game. For number 4, I've got the 2010 NLCS Game 6.
Whoa! Holy moly! That's a great list. I may have some of those ranked higher. This is crazy.
All right, so Ray, break it down for us.
All right. So the 2010 game, that's the Game 1 National League Championship against the Philadelphia Phillies, a team any Giants fan will tell you that they loathed at the time. Roy Halladay was the starting pitcher. We had, once again, Tim Lincecum getting things started here for us in a pivotal matchup that ended up being a very good series. But Lincecum had a brilliant outing, 8 strikeouts, 7 innings. He gave up 3 earned runs, but we gave up 4 to Halladay, and that was all that was needed in this one. Again, a game of inches. You just need 1 run to really get this thing going, and this was a really terrific game by another terrific pitching performance. And what more can you say about that? I mean, this was just, and again, Cody Ross, he was 3 for 2. He was a monster in that game. He was all over the place. I think he batted 353 at the time. And also, this was his 2 home run game. So he had 2 big bombs in this game. That was really ended up being the significance in the scoring. So you had us doing things on both ends to really make it count. You had the pitching when it needed to happen to close this thing out, to get it started, to keep Philadelphia's lineup at bay, which is a very good lineup, by the way. And then you had Brian Wilson and Javier Lopez coming in to do the dirty work in the late innings. Javier Lopez setting up, just doing his work in a just really small amount of work, but then Brian Wilson getting 4 outs in that game. And then 2012, that was the NLDS Game 5 against the Reds, October 11th. That was the 6-4 win. That one was also the I think Buster Posey had a home run in that one.
Grand Slam.
Yeah, he had the big one. And this was also the Matt Cain. Matt Cain has a good performance here, although his ERA wasn't great. Coming up to that point, I think he was up to like 5, but we had a lot of support from relief pitching. George Contos stepped in, Jeremy Affeldt stepped in, Javier Lopez stepped in, Santiago Casillas stepped in, and Sergio Romo closed this thing out for us. I believe this is when he was closing. So that was, again, just another terrific performance. This one stood out to me just because of what mattered in this game. This to me was a closeout game in a pivotal series to get to the next round. So closeout games mean a lot in my list. And the next one, the 2012 NLCS against the Cardinals. You already alluded to this, Will, but I picked this one because of, again, the significance. This was we were down 3-1, do or die, and Barry Zito comes in, who I loved in Oakland. He was brilliant in Oakland, but just really never lived up to his contract in San Francisco, although had this moment among a few others throughout this run where he really ended up earning his money when it mattered most, and he was brilliant in 7 and 2 innings pitched. Gave up 6 hits, but also struck out 6. And again, it didn't need a whole lot. It was a very typical game between, Barry giving an old school 7-inning performance, and then you have your setup and your closer. Casilla came in, and then Romo came in and closed it out. This was just, again, brilliant pitching, and against another pretty solid lineup. And Pablo Sandoval went for yard in that one. I think Brandon Belt had a double in that one, but it was just another. He blanked him. He blanked a really solid lineup. And then in 2014, this was against Kansas City Royals, who seemed to have they had a terrific narrative going into this postseason with the amount of time they hadn't been in the championship and all of the stars aligning against them. But Game 5. Here you have another shutout performance. I love these shutouts, by the way. And this one was by Madison Bumgarner, who gets the complete game. 4 hits, had a 1.13 ERA in this game. This was just terrific performance by what would become, a historic pitching performance throughout that entire series, and even the games leading up to that. Madison Bumgarner was just absolutely decimated the Kansas City Royals, and they were a pesky lineup too. They weren't, they didn't necessarily. I think there was some better lineups that we went up against in the postseason overall, but this was just a scrappy bunch, similar to the Giant. They had a similar scrappiness to the way the Giants played in terms of offense, but they had absolutely no answer for Madison Bumgarner, and this showed it here in Game 5, coming up again and having to deal with him a second time. And this was the rematch between Madison Bumgarner and James Shields, and James Shields just could not do enough. He gave up 7 in the first game and gave up 5 in this game. And so, he gave up 5 in this one. And again, not much you can do in that. Well, he actually didn't give up. It was relief pitching. Kevin Herrera gave up 2 runs, and Shields gave up 2 in that one. Earned runs, and that is not unearned. And that's that to me was big. So Madison Bumgarner, he's going to show up here again, of course, as I imagine he will on your guys' list. But that's my 7 through 4.
All right, what about you, Rudy?
All right. So just to kind of put it in perspective, now that we're done with 11 through 8, 2012 to me, and which is going to show up, obviously shows up a lot on this 7 through 4 list. 2012 for me, the run-up to the World Series. You mentioned earlier, Candlestick Will, that we sweep the Detroit Tigers, the best team in baseball, in 4. It's kind of it's not that dramatic, except for game 4 is the one where they really gave us a run. But outside of that, the series was pretty dominant for the Giants. But the run-up, the games played to get to the World Series, we were so close to being eliminated so many different times. I've never been more worried about the Giants than I was in the 2012 run-up to the World Series. Those playoff runs were insane, and that's why I picked the games that I picked for my list. So going back as a reminder, number 7, October 9th, 2012, Game 3 of the NLDS, the Vogelsong game. And you already mentioned Vogelsong was so clutch. He saves the season and thus saves the dynasty that is yet to occur. 5 innings pitched, 5 strikeouts, only 1 run earned, the only run that the Reds ever make that game. Romo closes out the game to keep us alive. The Giants win on the road at Cincinnati 2-1. Game 6, October 22nd, 2012, Game 7 of the NLCS, which already showed up on your list, Candlestick Will. I call this game the Hunter breaks the bat 3 times. And this game is so imprinted on my mind when I think of 2012. There's a couple of major moments, and this is one of them. This is probably one of the first big ones, is that Hunter breaking the bat 3 times. The Giants dominate the Cardinals. The Cardinals are the Yankees of the 21st century. They're the most successful team. When I say Yankees, they're the Yankees of the National League in the 21st century. They're the most dominant team that has come out of the National League, the closest thing we have to something like the New York Yankees. So for the Giants to beat them in 2 different postseason runs on their way to win World Series at that time was unfathomable. Like you are looking at a team. Now, also bear in mind, this is the team that won the 2011 World Series, right? Am I right? They won the 2011 one, not the 2013. Am I right? We won
the Cardinals.
Yeah. We won.
The Red Sox won in 2013.
Yes, 2013. We won 2010. They win 2011. Now we're facing them in the NLCS. Giants, Cardinals. Only one of these 2 previous champions is going on to the World Series. And Hunter Pence, who was so pivotal emotionally to that 2012 run, famously talking to this entire team, famously having that conversation during their series against the Reds when they were already down 2 games to and help propel them to win that Game 3, which was my number 7. Hunter goes in and he breaks that bat 3 times on that huge run. Giants win 9-0. They defeat the Cardinals at home. That's my number 6. Number 5, October 16th, 2014, Game 5 of the NLCS. I call this the Michael Morse and Travis Ishikawa game. We all remember. Michael Morse ties the game in the 8th, 3-3. Boom, we're down 2-3. He ties the game.
It was lackluster offensively up until that moment.
I mean, there really wasn't a lot happening again against the Cardinals. But then in the 9th, Ishikawa with the walk-off 3-run homer to send us to our 3rd World Series in 5 years. And I'll tell you, the 2 moments that are imprinted in my mind when I think of the 2012 postseason run, I think of Hunter Pence breaking the bat 3 times. When I think of 2014 and the 2014 run, all I remember, you guys know the moment, Travis Ishikawa running to home plate and the entire team sitting there, him throwing off his helmet and going crazy. Like when I think of the 2014 postseason run, that's the number 1 moment. And that moment and Hunter Pence with the bat, those are the 2 moments. That's why they ended up right here. I was like, these are the most important moments. They're the most exciting games, the biggest moments, the craziest moments, the moments that define the postseason run before the World Series. And that's why I got them at 6 and 5. And then at number 4, October 21st, 2012, Game 5 of the NLCS, a game that's already appeared on Candlestick Will, I believe on your list, right, is Zito blanks the Cardinals and saves the dynasty. You guys have already talked a lot about this. Zito was heavily criticized for the contract he had. Obviously had a very big career with the A's, had come over to the Giants. This was a huge pickup for the Giants. Everyone expected a lot out of him, expected him to kind of be the next, the other big pitcher with Kane and Lincecum, and he never really quite got it. But here we are in
I don't know what happened to him either. It was such a weird sharp drop off from what he did in Oakland with that big curveball. I think it was a combination of perhaps getting a little complacent with the big money, and then also the league figuring him out, because it wasn't until he got the slider that he was able to counterbalance some of that.
Yeah, and
his fastball dropped. The speed on his fastball dropped, and so he had to, be able to figure out how to pitch when the curveball and fastball speeds weren't that different anymore. And he couldn't get the timing, off of guys. I mean, when you're throwing a pitch that's only a few miles faster, no matter what you're throwing, it's so much easier for batters to sit on the curveball and avoid it.
There you go. And so to kind of paint the picture, to kind of further illustrate this game and why it ended up as number 4 on my list before my top 3, is that this is kind of like that Klay Thompson Game 6 game, where this is the Cardinals. Mm-hmm. This is the returning champs, NLCS. We are already down 3-1. All the Cards got to do is beat us here. And we're in St. Louis. They beat us here. They go to the World Series back to back. And once again, the most successful team of the 21st century for the NL goes on to win another World Series, or at least compete for another World Series. The Giants have no business beating this team. And we are bringing out Barry Zito, this guy that has literally failed us at every turning point. I remember being there in the stadium watching this guy get booed off the plate. I was there. I saw so many games in 2010 and 2012, and I watched him get booed off the plate. And Zito sits there, and with the entire season, and not knowing it, the entire dynasty on the line, he wins that game 5-0 and earns his money in one game. I remember walking through San Francisco, and everybody in San Francisco was saying at the same time, they're like, Zito earned it. He earned it every dollar, every penny. It was like he instantly all was forgiven off of that one game. And he had a couple other.
Yeah, all the regular season mishaps and just being really shitty in the regular season. All of that went out the window. Like, nope, that's okay.
That's okay. And he had one more big game, game 1 of the World Series against the Tigers. But that was the game that it's the Barry Zito game, man. He didn't know it. He saved the dynasty against, once again, the most dominant National League team, the St. Louis Cardinals. But that's why I put it number 4. It is of the games, even though we've got those the three bat break, Ishikawa, the walk off. For that game, it's not so much about how it's not so dramatic. Like I have those moments kind of imprinted in my brain. It's not. I don't have any moment imprinted. It's about the significance of that game, and that's why I put it at number 4, right before the 3. Because if Zito doesn't come in, and Zito has no business winning that game. Zito has failed us time and time again. He should have gone into that game and got his ass whooped. And we're going home, and we're not even having this top 11 podcast with the Giants on it. I don't know what we're doing, but we're doing something else. He had no business, but for him to go in and channel the Barry Zito of old and to save the season, save the dynasty, I had to put it at number 4. I put it as I think the most important game besides the final 3 on my list. So there you go. Now, Candlestick Will, defend your 7 through 4.
So for number 7, I had the 2012 World Series Game 1. So it's the other game where Barry Zito was actually pretty incredible, yes. Going head to head with Justin Verlander. My favorite moment of that game, I know I'm skipping over the Pablo thing, but I'll get to that in a minute. But the best moment of that game for me was when Barry Zito was up to bat, and Tim McCarver, who's one of the worst broadcasters in human history, had the most beautiful moment. It's, the meme of Antonio Banderas, kind of kissing the sky. It was the perfect moment to just encapsulate what a moron he is. That Justin Verlander, who's, one of the best pitchers in the world, facing Barry Zito at the plate, and McCarver at that moment says this might be the most, overmatched matchup in baseball history. And then the very next pitch, Zito laces a single and gets a hit off of Verlander. And it was the best thing ever, because not only did that happen, but then Zito outpitched Verlander. So those two things combined actually for me is even more enjoyable than the unbelievably incredible Pablo Sandoval hitting 3 home runs in that game. But after what we faced with the Reds, after what we faced with the Cardinals, there was I think there was an assumption that we were going to go 7 against the Tigers, and that this was going to be a tough series, because the Tigers on paper were better than the Cardinals and were better than the Reds. And we came out and Zito just shut the door in game 1, and Pablo Sandoval, went full Babe Ruth and hit 3 homers in a game in the World Series. And it was one of those games that every Giants fan will remember forever for what Pablo did. And I'll remember forever for what Pablo and Zito did. And it's one of the best games the Giants ever played. For number 6, I have a game that could easily be number 1, 2014 World Series Game 7. It's probably there's probably the best overall game from both sides of the 3 clinchers that we had in those 3 World Series years. Madison Bumgarner was superhuman and Paul Bunyan-like, and every single descriptive word you can use in a positive way is a way you can describe Madison Bumgarner that day, to come in and close that game. The chronic Brandon Crawford, Joe Panic double play off of who else but Jeremy Affeldt, pitching us out of another jam. And, just everything about that game was incredible. The back and forth, the edge of your seat when Gordon hits the triple that could have been an inside the park home run, the way that Blanco and Perez misplayed the ball so many times, that probably would have given every Giants fan heart palpitations had he scored. But for what that meant to just finish off the dynasty and cement the dynasty as this in fact was a dynasty, in 3 titles in 5 years, that game will be will never be overrated for what it meant. I've underrated it on my list because I think there's some games that happened before it that I think were more impactful to the Giants decade, because we don't get a dynasty without the other performances. But what Mad Bum did was just otherworldly. And then for number 5, I have the perfect game. It was actually a kind of a laugher, 10-0 game. But from the moment Blanco made that catch in right center to the last out, it was about as thrilling a 3 innings as we've ever seen. And for it to be on a random day in June just reminds us that baseball can be pretty incredible sometimes. And in that way is similar to some of the Clay performances we talked about last week with his 37 points in a quarter and 60 points in 3 quarters, and those kinds of games where something incredible can happen on a random day of the week game. And Matt Cain.
It's the game I remember the most in that 5-year run. It is the number 1 regular season game I remember, just like we said, just stamped in my brain. If you go best regular season game, gun to your head, I go Matt Cain's perfect game. I don't even think twice about it. It's the number 1 most important game I think the Giants, and the best game they played in that 5-year run.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. Matt Cain's my favorite player of all time across all sports, and that game kind of sealed his fate with the Giants as a forever a legend. And that 2012 season was near perfect for him in a lot of ways. Started the All-Star game, won every clinching game, or was the starting pitcher for every clinching game in the playoffs. His numbers his win total finally matched his numbers after pitching some incredible games for some terrible Giants teams in the beginning of his career. So that season is my favorite season, and for what Matt Cain was able to do. But I actually wasn't watching that game and was doing something else, and then noticed on the scroll that the Giants were up 10-0, and was like, oh wow, that sounds cool. Let's check that out. I go to turn it on, and it was minutes before the Blanco catch, and I'm looking at the screen, and I'm like, wait, 0 hits? Wait, does he have a no-hitter going? Like I was like learning as I was, as I had it on, and I was like, it's all zeros. Like, okay, all right, let's see what's going on. And then the Blanco catch, just you're on the edge of your seat every pitch, and it was one of the most incredible games of the decade, and one of the most incredible games in Giants history, period. And then for number 4, I have one of my all-time favorite games and one of my all-time favorite home runs in team history, the 2010 NLCS Game 6. It was the Juan Uribe game clinching home run in the 8th inning off of Madsen that sent the Giants to the World Series. And what people will always remember about that game is the Jonathan Sanchez, Chase Utley dust up that led to the two benches clearing, and everyone but Jeremy Affeldt going out on the field because Mark Gardner was a genius and made sure that Affeldt was ready to come in for Sanchez, who was ready to get yanked. And the fact that the Bruce Bochy and Gardner and the pitching staff had gotten together before the game and said, look, if Sanchez struggles, we're going to go right to Affeldt whenever that is, and right after that, we're going to make sure that Javier Lopez pitches and that even Madison Bumgarner, and we're going to make sure that there's all of our best lefties are going to pitch in this game because we do not want Utley and Howard to beat us. And the fact that they had it all planned out before the game started, and then had it ready when that moment happened, and then Affeldt being able to get out of the jam and then pitch another inning is, that game was one of the most perfectly pitched games in bullpen history for the Giants. And the fact that Bochy, had it all drawn out beforehand. And the same thing with the Game 7 that I just referenced, the Mad Bum. As far as we'll go to Jeremy Affeldt if Hudson struggles, and then we'll go to Madison Bumgarner after that. The fact that he kind of had that mapped out before the game started just reminds us how incredible Bruce Bochy was at managing bullpens and knowing what to do in the playoffs versus the regular season.
Former catcher. It means something.
Yep. All right, so honorable mention, where we at here? What do you got, Ray?
I've got 2010, October 23rd, Giants against the Phillies, NLCS Game 6. I've got 2012, October 25th, Tigers versus the Giants World Series Game 2. And I've got October 14th, October 5th, St. Louis Cardinals versus the Giants NLCS Game 5.
What about you, Rudy?
All right, so at number 5, I have 5 games. June 25th, 2014. And I've got at number 4, June 13th. 2013, both regular season games. At number 3, the infamous 2016 postseason run, the whole thing. At number 2, October 24th, 2012, you've already mentioned this game, Game 1 of the World Series. And at number 1, I made a big turn. At number 1, it's not a game, it's Bruce Bochy. I put Bruce Bochy as my honorable mention. He is the backbone. He is the Bill Walsh of the San Francisco Giants. He is the genius, the master behind the mayhem. And I thought, he needed honorable mention. I put him at number 1. And we've never done this. We've never put a player at an honorable mention, but I thought, or a manager or a coach. And I thought Bruce Bochy deserves the number 1 because without Bruce Bochy, there is none of this. He is the mastermind. So I put him at number 1 in my honorable mentions. Candlestick Will, what about you?
So there's one game that, you guys mentioned a couple of games that I would have also included, like the Yusmeiro Petit, Brandon Belt Nationals game and some of those. The one regular season game I was going to mention is the May 25th, 2013 Angel Bagan walk-off inside the park home run. That game was pretty epic, and my honorable mentions a pretty generic list outside of the Chris Heston no-hitter, the two Tim Lincecum no-hitters. Wanted to shout those out. But then otherwise, it's just the two wild card wins, the one against the Mets and then the one against the Pirates that you brought up, Ray. And then every playoff win that we didn't mention or that I didn't mention, every win over the Dodgers, in the regular season, and then personally every Kane win, and then any game where Bumgarner hit a homer, and then just those are the ones that I wanted to kind of shout out. Never a bad time to beat the Dodgers. So
no, and we hurt them pretty good this last year. Oh, that was a real nice little send off there. But let me go back real quick. I didn't really explain it because I kind of forgot that we don't explain these games. The number 4 and 5, June 25th, 2014. That was Lincecum's second no hitter, and number 4, July 13, 2013. Tim Lincecum's first no hitter. That's why those two no hitters. Those are the reasons those games made the list, and we already know about numbers 3, 2, and 1. I just wanted to get that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no hitters are so rare. Perfect games obviously are more rare, but they're so rare in baseball history, and they're super rare in Giants history. So the fact that we've had a perfect game and 3 no hitters in this decade is pretty incredible. All right, Ray, big moment now. What's your top 3?
All right, so mine's a little bit obvious. I went with 2010 November 1st, the Giants against the Rangers, World Series Game 5, closeout game. 2012, October 28th, Giants versus the Detroit Tigers, World Series Game 4, closeout game. And number 1, the 2014, October 29th, Giants versus the Kansas City Royals, World Series Game 7.
What about you, Rudy?
Ooh. All right. Well, virtually identical, but with a slight change. Number 3. October 28, 2012, Game 4 of the World Series, Giants versus Tigers to close out that series. Number 2, and this was really tough. This was my number 1 and 2 were really hard, guys. I really struggled on this. But I decided that my number 2 would be November 1st, 2010, Game 5 of the World Series, Giants defeat the Rangers. And my number 1, once again, Raymond and I are tied, and once again, we already know that we're not tied with Candlestick Will. Game 7 of the World Series, October 29, 2014. Giants defeat the Royals to win their 3rd World Series in 5.
Yeah, that was a no-brainer for me.
It was a no. That's why I was so shocked that it was so high up. And even Candlestick Will said, well, this game probably could be ranked higher, but he thought there were some games that happened previous. So now I'm dying to hear, and I know Raymond is too. Candlestick Will, what are your top 3 for the decade?
Well, they have all been mentioned, so it's not. I'm not shocking anyone with mine. But so for number 3, I actually have a 2-way tie. 2012 NLDS games 3 and 5. So the Hunter Pence speech game and the Posey Slam. For the number 2, I have the 2014 NLCS Game 6, that send us to the World Series, and then for number 1, I have the 2010 World Series Game 5. To win our first championship. I
had a feeling that Game 5 of 2010 was going to be Candlestick Will's no matter what. We've done this so much in such a short period. I can guess where you guys are going to go, and I knew no matter what, Candlestick Will, you were going to have Game 5 of 2010 at number 1. I knew I could have bet $100 on it. I would have done it. I've been like $100 on Candlestick Will putting that game in there, which is more than a worthy game for the number 1 spot.
All right, Ray, what do you got about your? I know your 3 are somewhat obvious, but why don't you break down for us what you got?
Well, if you don't close out these games, you you can't complete the championship. Well, at least in 2012, you could arguably have one extra game. It's not like it was a do or die. But in the Texas game, that one went to 5 games. Texas only managed to get 1 out of that, and I think they got game 3. But you got to close it out, and it was a 3-1 performance. And who better to close out 2010 than the man who started 2010 run, which was Tim Lincecum, with the 10 strikeouts in 8 innings. Just a terrific, again, had a 2.43 ERA throughout that postseason run. He was just brilliant the whole time. He was vintage Lincecum, the freak. And of course, we had our really ragtag group of veterans between Aaron Rowan, Edgar Renteria, Pat Burrell, Aubrey Huff, Juan Uribe, Cody Ross, Andres Torres, Buster Posey, who we drafted, and just a ragtag group of veterans, the scrappy veterans that just had finally come full circle in their careers to manage to get a ring. And it was just a great way to cap off a series. Although I was sad to see Ron Washington, who was the skipper over there in Texas, who was a brilliant third base coach with the Oakland Athletics, lose back-to-back World Series championships when he was heading the group, which was a brilliant offensive lineup. They just didn't really have the pitching to match all that power they had. And if there's one thing that you can usually count on more so than anything in postseason baseball, it's pitching over offense. And in 2012, that was the Game 4, the dominant sweep of the Detroit Tigers. They really were never really in it, although they gave a much better effort in this Game 4 than any other previous game, getting shut out in back-to-back games in Games 2 and 3 by a score of 2-0 in both contests, and of course getting blown out in Game 1 8-3. But this again was and Detroit had a terrific pitching lineup. They weren't necessarily.
Oh, yeah.
The Giants' record was they were these teams' records weren't too dissimilar, but Detroit just was balanced on both sides of the ball. They had amazing starting pitching. They had amazing bats. Miguel Cabrera, I'm not sure if that was the year he won Triple Crown or if it was another year.
Yeah, it was.
Was it Triple Crown year? Yeah, it was a Triple Crown year, which hadn't been done in forever. So they just had so much power but a friend of mine who's from Detroit, was talking about that, and I just told him, I said, you know what, you might have Verlander, but Verlander is great in the postseason up until the World Series. So, if he's able to keep his, because and it's true, Verlander has a really good postseason career overall, but he does tend to struggle in the World Series for whatever reason. I think he just can't seem to control his nerves as well as he can between all of the previous rounds. But Max Scherzer was actually the starting pitcher of that game, who pitched decently. He pitched 6 innings, gave up 3 runs, and only 1 homer, 8 strikeouts, and had a 2.0 ERA in that game. But again, Matt Cain, who really kind of dominated the starting pitching in this postseason year, was brilliant in this one in 7 innings. He gave up 3 runs as well, but he was still, he got things started, and it was Affeldt, Casilla, and Romo who helped close things out for us in the end. And actually, Phil Koch got the loss here. He was the last pitcher to come up and gave that one up, and that was also an extra innings game where the Giants closed it out in dramatic fashion. Not really much torture when you're up 3-0, but still, an exciting game nonetheless, a fun way to close out the series. And of course, in 2014, what more can be said between the Giants and the Royals? The Royals, who gave us more trouble than any other team in postseason outside of the Cardinals. And what better dramatics to have in a World Series than a 7-game stretch going the whole 9 yards with a team that, Kansas City, you would believe, but based on how everything played out in this series, Kansas City wanted to win this series just as much as the Giants. And this really just came down to one player that was the X factor for us in Madison Bumgarner that Detroit really just didn't have an answer for, no matter when he came in, whether it was Game 1, the 7-1 win, or it was Game 5, the 5-0 shutout. Madison Bumgarner just seemed to have their number, and Kansas City didn't have an answer. And sure enough, when he came in to close out, I'm sure that Kansas City Royals fans were just, biting their nails just because it's like we've only gotten one score off this guy, and here he's coming in again to close it out. And sure enough, he got the big closeout there. And this was just that was, to me, the part that stood out the most, even though Tim Hudson started us off, but he gave up 2 runs quick, and he got pulled in a heartbeat. And Jeremy Affeldt came out in relief and did a couple of innings work, but Madison Bumgarner put in 5 strong innings to close this one out in just what was an amazing performance, an amazing run. Only had a 1.03 ERA. That's closer territory type numbers, short of a 0 point something ERA, but he was right there knocking on the door, and just had nasty stuff the entire series. And what better way to close out a Game 7 than with the man who started us off in that series, with Madison Bumgarner, who had 3 amazing performances in that series to give our 3rd championship run and solidify the dynasty.
All right. What about you, Rudy?
All right, so same exact games, just in a different order. As I mentioned, October 28, 2012, Game 4 of the World Series. I will tell you guys a great story. I think Raymond really closed out the game. I will tell you where I was at. So every year there is a very famous Halloween boat party that takes place in San Francisco. Many of my friends have been going in the double digits. I've been going for over 10 years. And I was on that boat on October 28, 2012. I was on the top floor of that boat. And on the top floor of that boat, there were 2 groups of about 20 people in full circles around 2 different iPads playing the game. And there was a chant going, "Let's go Giants." And they were just doing that over and over. And I walked up there and ran up to one of the groups, and we were all watching the game on this iPad up there, these 2 big groups. And we're watching Romo, and he's on the final out. And about 15 seconds before he makes the pitch, the second group jumps and starts cheering and running around the boat. And we look and we go, oh, man, we're probably about to win the World Series. And then, boom, game ends. We sweep the Tigers. We go crazy. We then follow that up by going into the city, we go into San Francisco. The entire city is going absolutely bonkers. And whenever I think about Game 4 of 2012, I remember standing in that crowd and all of us cheering on a boat, "Let's go Giants," with the clap. And we're sitting there just cheering on the final out from Sergio Romo for the Giants. And that is what I remember most from that series. It was so dope. Number 2, November 1st, 2010, Game 5 of the World Series. Candlestick Will is number 1. This was the toughest decision to make. Do I put the closeout game of the first World Series or the closeout game of the last World Series? It was never a doubt to me that these were number 1 and 2. It was just a matter of where they went. I can't impress upon the listeners how important and what this game meant to the city of San Francisco. This is the first championship ever won in the city of San Francisco by a team not named the San Francisco 49ers. We'd seen the Warriors lose championships. We'd seen the Giants lose championships. There was only one team that had ever delivered us any championships, and it was a dynasty, and that was the 49ers. And this was the first time a team not named the 49ers brought a ring to San Francisco. And little did we know is kickstarting the beginning of the dynasty of San Francisco, the San Francisco Bay Area. This is the dynasty that would dominate not just San Francisco. It's better than Boston. It's better than New York. It's better than every other single city. And if we had one guy sitting at the national level for sports journalism, we'd be hearing it from the rooftops. Can you imagine if Bill Simmons' teams were named Giants, 49ers, and Warriors? If his teams were these teams, if we let's pretend the Patriots never exist and his 3 teams were these, we would never hear the end of it. Oh my God, we would be inundated with how successful his city has done, or Stephen A. Smith, or Skip Bayless. You name the guy, Colin Cowherd. You name the guy. If their teams we're from San Francisco. If they were Giants, Warriors, and 49ers fans, just how we would never hear the end of how successful their teams are. But because none of it, it's all swept under the rug. But regardless, this game right here to win the first World Series, to bring the first championship to the city from a different team, it was so important. It was so vital. I never went to more baseball games in my life than the 2010 year. I started going in 2008, went to a bunch more in 2009, and then probably went to about 25 to 30 games in 2010. I was literally, it felt like I lived at that stadium. And I was at Game 1 of the World Series in 2010. I was at Game 1. I was right there in left field when we started that big rally. I was there. In fact, I found myself, if you were to go on my Facebook, I found myself on the actual TV screen cheering when that first home run hit. I found myself and circled it and posted it. I was right there in the thick of it, and that's why it was tough to put that at number 2. But the reason I put it at number 2, which has kind of already been stated by Raymond, number 1, October 2019, 2014, Game 7 of the World Series. I don't know what else I can say. It is probably, arguably, that whole series is the most dominant pitching performance by a pitcher in World Series history. Bumgarner takes down the Royals. Raymond, you already said it. The Royals wanted this as bad as the Giants, and you worded it perfectly. It came down to one guy. And in fact, the Royals, they basically channeled their inner San Antonio Spurs, and the next year went on a tear and went back and won the World Series in exact same fashion when the Spurs lost to the Heat in 2013 in the NBA Finals, and then came back in 2014, destroyed everybody, and won the NBA Finals. The Royals did the exact same thing. They literally, it was verbatim. They get beat in this series, come back and win the next one. They wanted it so bad. Both these teams came from the wild card. I'll never forget, at the time, my neighbor was a diehard Kansas City Royals fan, and him coming out of his apartment after the wild card, and us both winning, going, man, pretty crazy, pretty crazy. Wouldn't it be crazy? I remember going, would it be crazy if somehow the Royals and Giants made it? We're like, yeah, it might not, it'll probably not happen, but it would be crazy. Absolutely. We both said that. And then every time after every series for each of our teams, we'd come walking out into the courtyard and talk about each series. And as the postseason went on, we both started to get more and more nervous and both started to think, you know what, this Giants-Royals thing, this might happen. This is for real. This is in play. And we both started to get more and more nervous. And when this series ended, I'll never forget running out of my apartment, screaming at the top of my lungs in enemy territory, Los Angeles, and then him coming out and shaking my hand. And I'll give you guys one final story for the Game 7 series, just on my experience of it. I cannot say any more than you said, Raymond. Bumgarner, I think it's just a single greatest pitching performance I've ever seen. Raymond, you talked about the Kansas City Royal crowd. So I have a friend of mine, Will Weston. He owns a bar, Cafe Royale in San Francisco. He is a diehard Kansas City Royals fan. And earlier in the century, he actually got on a bike and rode a bike, him and his friend, from San Francisco to Kansas City to the Royal Stadium. Wrote them a letter telling them of his intention to do it. They said, if you do it, we'll put you on the Jumbotron. We'll interview you. We'll get you seats behind the catcher's plate, which they did, right? The Royals actually go in to that bar during this run. The Kansas City News records them in this bar. They're all there, the Royals there, and he records them inside the bar, talking to Will, the whole nine. Literally, Royals players are in that bar for this news segment. He goes to Game 7. He goes to Game 7. And he told me, he said, we were super raucous, we were super wild, everybody was going crazy. And then he said, Bumgarner walks across the field. And we all remember, Bumgarner's walking across the field. They're showing his face. He's got the hat. He's got the shadow. And we cut and they cut to commercial, right, as he's walking across. He told me that the stadium went into complete silence. He said you could have heard a pin drop. We watched Madison Bumgarner walk across the field to the mound. And he told me, he goes, right then and there, we still got 5 innings left to go. He said, right then and there, we knew it was over. He said, we did. He goes, I knew it was over. He goes, I knew it. We were done. He goes, the crowd went into a silence and no one said a word as he walked across the field. So you were saying, Raymond, to yes and your thing, like the crowd must have been crazy. That is coming from a diehard Royals fan that was in the crowd that day. The crowd went into a hush and said nothing as he walked across the field. And that's probably my favorite story from Game 7. But for me, it's the most dramatic victory that they had. And unquestionably, as much as I wanted to put the first World Series, I had to put Game 7 as my number one. All right, Candlestick Will, your turn, buddy. What defend your final three.
So, like I said, for number 3, I had a tie between the Game 3 and Game 5 of the 2012 NLDS. Game 3 is the Hunter Pence speech, wanting one more day with you guys. The Reverend speaking up and telling everybody that they need to play for each other and how much he loves everybody. And then they go out and they beat the Reds in a must-win game. The Giants actually had a pretty easy run. In 2012, they clinched the playoffs pretty quickly, whereas in 2010 and 2014 they didn't get into the very end of the season. But in Game 3 against the Reds, they won 2-1 in 10 innings, and then in Game 5 they won 6-4. And obviously the Buster Posey grand slam off of Matt Latos is one of the greatest home runs in San Francisco Giants history. But that game, came down to Sergio Romo once again finding a way. That year, he just kind of got into his bag and found every pitch that he had besides the nasty slider, and found ways to get guys out even when the slider wasn't working. And it really showed what kind of a competitor Sergio Romo was, and it wasn't just talent. But Game 3 and 5 that in that series was just two of the most incredible performances I've ever seen by a collective group. And then for number 2, I have the 2014 NLCS Game 6, maybe the greatest home run in Giants history, in Travis Ishikawa's walk-off, and it might be the second best home run of that game, because Michael Morse's home run off Nishak was more improbable, more tense because we were down at that moment, and Michael Morse comes in and does exactly what he was supposed to do, which is to come in and get a pinch hit, extra base hit. But the fact that he hit a home run to tie the game was even more incredible. It might be the greatest trot around the bases in the history of the sport. I don't think I've ever seen anyone with more joy on their face and more happy about what they had just accomplished than Michael Morse rounding the bases after that home run. And by the time Ishikawa got up to the plate, he basically just needed to get a ball into the outfield. So the fact that it went over the fence was just, even more exciting and more thrilling. And there's nothing quite like a walk-off to send your team to the World Series. And it's happened so rare in baseball history. So that game is just incredible for all those obvious reasons. But the only reason it's not number one for me is because it's really hard to ever top the first championship. And it's really hard to ever top the clinching game in that first championship. Edgar Renteria's home run in that game was the one that's going to live forever. The Dave Fleming call that every Giants fan will remember forever. It's a game that was the ultimate, pitching duel between Cliff Lee and Tim Lincecum. And just like in Game 1, Tim Lincecum got the best of Cliff Lee, who was one of the best pitchers in the world at the time. And Lincecum was just was the best pitcher in the world in 2010, and he proved it again that night, going 8 innings, and Brian Wilson closing the door. And maybe the best moment of this decade for me is Brian Wilson striking out Nelson Cruz, because for a fan who was born in 1980 and saw the heartbreak of '89, saw the heartbreak of 2002, and all the heartbreaks in between, to to finally see that last pitch go for a strike, to finally see a season end with a win. It was a moment that I'll never forget. It was a parade that I'll never forget, and it's the greatest game of my lifetime as a Giants fan. It's going to be impossible to beat unless my son becomes a San Francisco Giant and wins a game.
Let me ask you a question, Candlestick Will. So you were at the parade?
I was at the 2010 parade and I was at the 2012 parade.
Nice. I was at the 2010 parade too. Ray, you were at 2010, weren't you as well?
I believe so. Yeah, and 2014.
Yeah, I missed the last two. My parade was being there the night of the game, and then I had to go back to Los Angeles, and then obviously 2014 I was in LA. But to Yes and You, Candlestick Will, we talked about moments, and that's just really what kind of helped lead me. Is like, what are the moments that are just burned in my memory? Brian Wilson throwing that final strike, turning around and doing his signature cross to the double point to the air and looking up to his father. That is the moment for me when I think about 2010. It's the moment that's etched. It's like the Ishikawa run. That is the moment that is just burned in my memory. And when I think of 2010, I'll remember that forever.
So any final thoughts, Ray?
It's a dynasty. I love doing a list on teams that are a dynasty because it's challenging, it's fun, it's great to reminisce, especially with this particular dynasty because there were so many moments in this dynasty that just really, it wasn't like a traditional dynasty where you win 3 straight. It was 3 every other year within 5. And there's just so many moments. I mean, you guys mentioned moments that, like the perfect games and all that stuff in the regular season. To me, I just stuck to the playoffs. That was kind of where my mind was at, although there was many moments throughout the regular season that were quite memorable too. So kudos to you guys for keeping that in light. Because a lot of times in these lists, I'm always going to stick to the postseason. That's just how my brain works. But yeah, super fun list to come up with, and super fun to remember these moments, especially walking in the streets with everybody, with all the fans, as at least the good hours, not the bad hours, when it gets too late and people start flipping buses over for no apparent reason. But yeah, that was just really fun. I enjoyed this. This was great. I had a really good time. Go Giants.
What about you, Rudy?
I think to yes and your number 3, the NLDS against the Reds is probably my favorite postseason series of their entire dynasty. It was so crazy. It was so scary. We lost the first 2. We had to win 3 in a row. We had no business winning 3 in a row. And we got blanked in the second game. And I just think that's the most memorable series. It's the one that sticks with me out of all the playoff runs. It's the series that I just thought we were dead. I thought it was over. I was like, we got 2010, right? Good job, guys. Hey, we got 2010. Hey, good show, boys. Let's go home. We'll see you next year. And for them to pull that out and then to go all the way on that run, and then, of course, face elimination against Cardinals, and then just destroy the Tigers. But I agree with you. I think it's a worthy number 3 because for me, the NLDS 2012 is without a doubt my favorite postseason series. It's the most dramatic of the postseason runs, not including the World Series. And yeah, it was super, super killer, that one. And then your 2014 LCS Game 6, that was my number 5, and obviously the Ishikawa Michael Morris home runs they're just etched, and so to have those at your number 2, again, similar to how I feel about the NLDS, like those moments are the most memorable I have, but beyond the 3-run, the 3-ball hit from Hunter Pence. I don't actually have we talked about that for the October 2012 Game 5. I don't really have a memorable moment. It's just what it meant to the entire run. Zito, and what Zito was able to do was so incredible. But yeah, so kind of basically just kind of yes-ending your list, and like Raymond said, go Giants, man. You know, I'm still mad about 2016, but to pull off a dynasty, and then have people try to say it wasn't a dynasty was a travesty and a slap in the face. When if Boston had done this, if the Yankees had done this, we'd be seeing that D word posted everywhere, all over the place. That was a little bit of an insult, but as history has gone on,
don't count. Those opinions don't count. It's a dynasty. You know, they didn't win 3 straight, which is a traditional dynasty, but you win 3 and 5 in a game as difficult to win consecutive championships as baseball, then you're a fucking dynasty.
Well, as Candlestick Will said, this only happened 5 times in the history of the World Series. 5 times ever.
Yes. Yeah, the Yankees were the last ones to do it.
Well, and the Yankees did it a lot, and nobody else really has ever done it. You know, it's like the A's did it, the Cardinals did it, and the Giants did it. You know, so it's like when you really think about, like, is something a dynasty in baseball, the criteria is so much different than basketball or football or any other sport, because baseball is the hardest to repeat. There's just way too many regular season games that leads to way too many possible injuries, that repeating is so much harder. You know, the fact that the Cardinals, you know, have had the kind of success that they've had over the last decade, and the Red Sox have had the kind of success they've had over the last decade, and the Giants had the success they had over the last 5 years, you know, that's the list. There are no other. I mean, the Royals getting to back-to-back was, you know, again, that's an incredible accomplishment, because for the most part, you get there once and that's it. You know, the Indians got there once and that's it. The Cubs got there once and that's it. You know, this decade has a lot of different teams getting there once, and it's because it's so hard to go back. So the Giants getting to 3 World Series by themselves, even if they had lost all 3, would still be impressive. The fact they won all 3 is just incredible. And what if someone says it's not a dynasty? It doesn't matter, because they're wrong, because it's of how rare it is in baseball. So it just is. You know, and there's too many people that know the game that have called it a dynasty for fans to think, oh, well, but they didn't win in 11 or 13. It's like, okay, fine. But, you know, they were a damn good team in 11 before Posey got his leg broke. And that was it's what's funny. I was going to mention it before. So that May 25th, 2013 game with Angel Pagan, the game that Posey broke his leg was also May 25th, 2011. May 25th is my birthday, so it's easier for me to remember that, you know, those dates. But it was like one of the worst things to ever happen to any Giant ever happened on my birthday in 2011. One of the best games ever in the regular season happened 2 years later. But they were in first place when Pagan scored on that walk-off inside the park home run. That year in 2013, they could have easily made the playoffs had they continued to be able to play at that pace. And then in 2011, they were in the hunt for the playoffs before Posey broke his leg. And had they made a couple of moves at the trade deadline, they might have been able to get back there in 2011. And their pitching staff in 2011 was pretty remarkable. So the idea that they were or were not a dynasty because they didn't go for 2 years, they were actually pretty damn good in the 2 years they missed. They just didn't finish it off because it is so hard. You know, we love to bag on the Dodgers on this podcast because they're from LA and they're the Dodgers.
And they suck.
They've gone to back-to-back World Series. They've won 7 straight NL West titles. Both of those things are super impressive. I love the fact that they haven't won a World Series in that time, but that's still super impressive, especially compared to baseball history. So it's like you can pretend things aren't the way they are, but in this case, the Giants absolutely have a dynasty in that stretch. The fact that it was only 5 years is pretty brutal. But to your point, 2016 they were right there, and had they been able to get past the Cubs in 2016, then
it was a wrap.
On our list would have definitely been a couple of those Connor Gillespie games, because that 2016 wildcard game was epic, with Madison Bumgarner going 9 and going head-to-head with Noah Syndergaard. And then the Connor Gillespie home run off of Familia was just poetic. And then he had the bases clearing double in the Cubs game that we ended up losing because we went with 15 relief pitchers in the last inning.
Yep.
And I know you were mentioning before about your feelings about Santiago Casilla, and I know that he did struggle as a closer, but I'll say this to my grave. I'll say this for the rest of time. Santiago Casilla was a very good relief pitcher. He was one of our best relief pitchers ever. His numbers prove it. He wasn't a great closer, but considering what a closer is supposed to do, which is just help you finish a game in the ninth inning, he was damn good when he had any kind of a lead. When he had a 1-run lead, sometimes his numbers weren't so great, but when he had a 2 or 3-run lead, he was almost always lights out, and the numbers prove that. And we had a multiple run lead going into the ninth in that game. So had Bruce Bochy stuck with Santiago Casilla and just kept him as the closer instead of pulling him because of fan pressure and whatever else led to that decision, he would have closed out that game.
I agree.
I believe that. I think because of all of the criticism he was getting for all the flack he was getting for the blown saves that he had, almost all the blown saves he had were 1-run leads, which is really hard to stop. I mean, most closers suck at that. There's Mariano Rivera and there's everybody else. So it's like the idea that he was supposed to be perfect is unrealistic, but he actually was not only one of our best closers, one of our most versatile. And the fact that he had to become our closer because of lack of options was disappointing because he was great at being a multiple inning guy. He could get guys out right and left-handed. He could get guys out in a tough situation against the heart of a lineup. But he took on the challenge of being our closer because we needed him. And I compare him similarly to when Benji Molina was asked to be our cleanup hitter and then went a couple of years in a row hitting 20 home runs. He wasn't a home run hitter, but he knew he needed to be able to do that for that team at that time. And so Casilla wasn't a closer, but he found a way to do the best he could at that spot because we needed him to, because we didn't have anybody else. And but we ended up just not going with Casilla at all and going with everybody else, trying to get one out here and one out there. And the Cubs knew that we didn't know what we wanted to do, and knew that we were throwing out guys that had struggled, and they feasted on it. And I think had we just gone with Casilla from the beginning, then he gets us through that inning, no sweat, and we move on to the next game where Johnny Cueto beats the Cubs. So that's my little rant for tonight about about Casilla. But more to the point, forget Casilla for a second. Those Connor Gillespie moments are some of the most easily forgotten moments of the last 10 years because of the fact we didn't close things out in 2016, and we had such epic endings to 2010, 12, and 14 that the Connor Gillespie home run against the Mets and the bases clearing double against the Cubs are two of the greatest at-bats in Giants history, and most people don't mention them on lists like this because of how many incredible other wins we had in the years prior. Yeah.
No, definitely, and I agree with you. I remember when they spoke to the Cubs after during winter conference, they were asked what was the hardest series to play, and they said obviously it was the 7-game series against Cleveland, and they said no, it was against the Giants. They said that was the hardest game, and they said we were not confident. If we lost Game 4 and had to go back to Chicago, we were not confident that we could win. We didn't know. They said that was the hardest series. We knew if we could beat the Giants, we could win the World Series. And that just shows you just what the shadow that the Giants were casting on the league at the time, and the fact that they were back in it on another even-numbered year. And I agree with you. Had we just gone with the lineup, had Bochy just trusted himself and not started to put everybody else in, I think we win. We go back to Game 5. We take care of Chicago. And we handle business, and we're talking about 4 World Series in 6 years. I really truly believe that, like without a doubt. I really wasn't scared of anybody else. It was like just get past the Cubs, we win the whole thing. There's no one left. No one left all the way through. So I agree with that. But gentlemen, a wonderful list. Now going back to you, GoldCast Nation, Top 11 podcast. What is your top 11 Giants games of the decade. Let us know at Top 11 Podcast on Twitter. You can let us know on youtube.com/the GoldCast. You can let us know at @the_GoldCast. Many, many options for you. Let us know what your top 11 San Francisco Giants games of the decade are. We're going to be back next week to now finish the tournament. It is now the Niners against the Warriors against the Giants. What are the top 11 best games of the decade? What are they? What order do they fall in? You've heard all the games. You've seen our lists. Now we will decide who takes the top 11 greatest games of the last 10 years. And so concludes another edition of the Top 11 Podcast. We are the voice of the Bay. I'm your host, Rudy Solis III, and with me is my brother, my co-host,
Raymond Solis first, baby.
And our esteemed co-host,
Candlestick Will.
Boom! We will see you next week. Same Top 11 time, same Top 11 channel.
This is the GoldCast.